Hope you can hear me now. I'm just going to wait for a thumbs up in the chat box or somebody to acknowledge that you can hear me. Can you hear me? Is there still no sound? Okay. Well, I'm getting a little green light flashing on the microphone, so I'm assuming that you're going to be able to hear me now. Okay, excellent. I just got confirmation from Avril. Hello, Avril. So, what I was saying was to repeat myself again. Díomh gach daoine agus fáilte go dtí a coibh brethbh is mis cuimhín ó Flanagan. Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to the Brehon Academy tonight, and I'm Kevin Flanagan. And I realized that I haven't posted a video in about a month, and there's good reason for that. Part of the reason is that I was in Georgia, in Tbilisi, where I had the chance to speak about public speaking, which is a thing that I used to do before when I worked for my previous employer. And I was pretty nervous about doing this just because it had been the first time that I spoke about public speaking since the surgery happened. And it went really well, even if I do say so myself. Um, Now, this is the first time I'm doing a live stream, so please, have a bit of patience. I may lose my train of thought at certain points throughout this. But to come back to the talk that I gave at Tbilisi, it just felt great to be back in my element, back doing the thing that I'm good at and the thing that I love. And even though I've spoken publicly at other events, that was always about Brehon law or Irish heritage, Irish culture. And I don't think people would scrutinize your standard so much when you're talking about things that are kind of not about public speaking. But as soon as you start talking about public speaking, you're automatically being judged on your ability to speak well. And this event in Tbilisi happened a year to the week since the surgery. And I think there's something kind of poignant about that. And I used to live in Tbilisi in Georgia before the pandemic, and it was kind of surreal, but in the best possible way, to be back in the city that I used to live in. Because I used to travel a lot when I was in my old job, and my now ex-wife and I were planning to move to Tbilisi, but then the pandemic happened. So we never got to move to Tbilisi. And 2 years later, when I found out that I had a brain tumor, it was the same week that the war began in Ukraine. And so I just got the news that I had the brain tumor. And then when I got the second opinion, that day was the day the war started. It was February 22nd, 2022. And that's an interesting date because it's 2/22/2022. Maybe there's something poignant about that. I don't know. Could be. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to share that that's one of the reasons why I haven't been posting. Um, and a lot has happened in the meantime. For example, I was very sad to hear the news of departing of the legend Manchán Magan. And what I decided to do was run a competition because I have a copy of his book here that's signed. Listen to the land speak. It's signed by Manchán Magan on the inside cover there. Can you see it? No. There. Um, Now I did run a competition, or I tried to run a competition like a few months ago before I went away, basically a month ago. And I didn't get any responses for that. Maybe I didn't like publish it enough. or promoted enough. So what I'd like to do is to run another competition now. And this is going to be open to, I just want to check, it's only going to be open to members, but not the entry level. It's probably the basic level subscription. Let me just double check. Uh-huh. Earn. Okay. This is going to be open to, I think, basic supporters. Yeah. So entry supporters, you can't enter, but if you're a basic supporter or higher, you can enter. And I'm going to post a competition. I'm going to post a question for the competition on the YouTube posts feature. And I'll probably post it on Facebook as well. So if you want to be part of this competition, then please consider becoming a member. This is a really good book. I've read it myself. I have another copy of it that's addressed to me. This is the second copy that I have. It's Listen to the Land Speak. And on the back, it says things like, we could do a lot more. Do with a lot more characters like Manchán dotted about this world. And it's just very sad to learn recently that this man has died of cancer. And when I met him a couple of months ago, and I'm really glad that I met him because it gave me the opportunity to get all of these books signed. And he was very open about speaking about his cancer because I originally got a video from him, thanks to my friend, you know who you are. I don't think I should mention your name, but I got a video from Manchán speaking Irish, wishing me the best of health. And little did I know that he was also dealing with an aggressive form of cancer. So I mentioned that to him, the video, when we met that time in the Fumbally, in the city centre. And he was very kind and he had a lot of questions, but he was also very open about talking about his own illness as well. So that's the competition I'm going to launch this month, and it's going to be open to, as I said, members only, but that's just to encourage people to become members because you're going to have a lot more opportunities like this in the future. I have a lot of books, and I have a lot of books that I have 2 copies of that I'm prepared to give away. The other news is I'm delighted to announce that I have been working as a tour guide since August the 18th. And I remember the date because that's my mother's birthday. And I'm really enjoying it. Like, I just did a tour today of the Book of Kells and Dublin Castle. And since I started the tours, I've been inside the long room of Trinity College about 5 or 6 times. And I'm getting better and better each time. The first time I was very nervous, of course I would be. But now I'm kind of getting into my flow. And there was 9 people on the tour today. 8 of them were from the US and 1 of them was Italian. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about those tours as we go on through this live stream. But I really love sharing my heritage and having the opportunity to share my heritage, our Irish heritage, with visitors to this island. And I never get bored of going into that long room and never get bored of talking about all the stuff they're going to see in the long room, like the Proclamation of Independence, the Proclamation of the Republic, the Brian Boru harp, the busts. And I even talk about how it was this library was used in Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, I think, when Obi-Wan Kenobi went to the Jedi archive. And it's almost exactly the same, even down to the busts that they use. But when I was watching that movie, I recognized it straight away. I'm like, oh, that's Trinity College Library. But it turned out that George Lucas Studios didn't have permission to use that image, or to use the image is of Trinity College Long Room Library, and they were sued for that. Trinity College actually sued Lucas Studios, but it was settled out of court, so we don't really know the details of that case. Um, and Harry Potter also featured the library in Harry Potter, the private section or the restricted section in Harry Potter is modeled on the long room, but they did ask for permission, so they didn't have they didn't have to be brought to court and pay an undisclosed sum. Let's just say that. Um, and then I go to Dublin Castle, which is I'm just like learning about the Viking history of Viking Dublin, and that's where Dove Linn is. That's the Dove Linn is the black pool where the River Poddle and the River Liffey met, and I get to talk about how the Vikings named Dublin, but they named it from an Irish name that already existed. The Vikings called it Dyflin, Dyflinn, but the name Dublin already existed. And it just, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Vikings when I start doing the presentation, um, because there was a lot of cross-pollination once the Vikings settled. There was a lot of sharing of languages. Um, and so I'm just like really, I feel like really blessed and privileged. And it's also an opportunity to, practice my speaking and practice my public speaking mixed with a love of my heritage. So I'm really grateful and happy to be doing this work. Now I'm going to jump into the presentation now. Um, but before I do, I just want to mention that since this is a live stream, you can do super chats, and I will read out all the super chats at the end, I suppose. But of course, if you want to just leave comments, I'll read them out as well. So it doesn't have to be super chats, but if you want to really make your comments stand out, um, you can do a super chat. Is there anything else I wanted to mention? I don't think so. So without further ado, let me just share the screen here. Okay, and just make sure that the presentation is up. Okay, and okay. Sorry, folks. Okay, and now play. Okay. Are you seeing the screen with on Scéal na Gaeilge? I think you are. Okay, let me just double check. Uh, okay, and I want to put myself in the corner over here. Okay. Now I can't actually check the live stream at the moment because I have what I'm looking at on the screen here. Um, so Avril, if you could message me on Telegram and let me know if you can see the little me up in the little corner in the top right corner, that would be perfect. Thank you. Okay, so on Scéal na Gaeilge, Siúlóid ghhearr trí stair na teanga ó Caoimhín ó Flanagan. And tá sonas an domhan orm, mar is féidir lum leabhart in Gaeilge live a lucht féachana a nocht. I have the happiness of the world on me because I get to speak in Irish with you, my audience, my viewers tonight. Ach táim an nervíseach mar níl mé lífa sa Gaeilge, agus ní mé ag labhart mar an Gaeilge, mar tá an ódachas Gaeilge i mo thír, i mo chuntaí, an cac. But I'm very nervous because I'm not fluent in Irish and I don't speak much Irish, even though I'm learning. Because the Irish education in my country is let's just say very bad. Okay, that's the polite way of saying cack. Now, this is the story of the Irish language and a brief walk through the history of the language. Ach is bralum an Gaeilge a leabhart agus fólam mar tá grá mór I mo chroí Dumatanga. Agus tá a lán brán orm go bhfuil deachrachtaí a gom leis an Gaeilge. But I love speaking and learning Irish because I have a lot of love in my heart for my language, and I am sad that I have difficulties or struggle with Irish. So this presentation, as I've mentioned, is called Scéal na Gaeilge, or in English is the story of Irish Gaelic. And before I get into this, as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm not fluent in Irish. So please, if you are fluent in Irish, you know, just give me a bit of grace and a bit of patience, because I'm doing this just to bring awareness to the language, especially for people who live overseas, because that's a large part of my audience. So people from the USA, Canada, Australia, and so on. Now, I've divided it into two parts because it is quite long. And I should say, before I jump into it, that this is an evolution of a presentation that I gave in work during a lunch hour, which was called Lunch and Language. And because I was the only Irish guy on staff, I was asked to speak about the Irish language, which I found challenging because I'm not fluent in Irish. And as I mentioned, the education in Irish in my country is cack. So I've divided it into two parts. Part one, or Cuid a Hain, is going to talk about some background to the language. And then there's going to be a long section talking about the history of the language in relation to the history of Ireland. And then we're going to end this section on a discussion on the usage of Irish Gaelic today. Now, Cuid a Dó, or part two, is going to focus on the alphabet, the grammar, rules of pronunciation, some phrases to practice, and its weirdness and influence on the English language. And I'm going to share with you some words in English that come from Irish, and you might be surprised to learn that certain words that you use on a daily basis actually have Irish origins. And finally, I'm going to finish with a poem about Irish in Irish. Okay, so background, history, and usage today. The background. Now, to start off, I want to introduce you to this. It's called the Indo-European and Uralic languages family tree. And we're going to zoom in just to the small branch right here, the Celtic languages. And there's two forms of Celtic languages, okay? There's Q-Celtic, which include Irish, Scottish, and Manx. Manx is the language that they speak. Manx is the Isle of Man, essentially, which is named after Manchán Magan, the god of the Irish god of the sea. And then you have P-Celtic, which is a Brittonic branch. This is the language that's mostly spoken on the neighbouring island of Britain. And these include Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. Now, the primary difference between P-Celtic and Q-Celtic languages lies in the treatment of the Proto-Indo-European Q sound, which evolved into a P sound in P-Celtic languages. So let me give you an example. The word for head is pen in Brittonic or P-Celtic languages like Welsh, but it's ceann in the Gaelic branch of languages, the Q-Celtic languages, like Irish, Scottish, and Manx. Similarly, the word for sun is map in Welsh and the Brittonic or P-Celtic languages. And that map becomes mac in the Q-Celtic languages, and Mac is the Irish for son, and that's where you get surnames like McCarthy, okay, MacFuribus. Every time you see a Mac, every time you see a Mac in a surname, it means the son of. And O, incidentally, means the grandson of or the descendant of. So that's just a little bit of the background to say that there's six, at least six Celtic languages, but we're only going to focus on one today, and that's Irish Gaelic. Now, there was four primary epochs or eras of Irish language. Now, just because this slide says that the Old Irish began around the 600 AD, the early 7th century, that's only because that's when the written record begins. St. Patrick came to Ireland around 432 AD, and that's why I have his picture there. And with St. Patrick, he brought a very special invention, a very special discovery, which was writing. And the reason why we have Latin letters in Irish is because of St. Patrick. So this was around the golden age of Irish monastic schools. And the reason why Ireland flourished at this time is because, very special, a very simple reason, is because the Roman Empire never got their clutches into Ireland. Now, we can talk about the Vatican a bit later on, but the Roman Empire never came to Ireland. So while the rest of Europe collapsed in terms of farming, in terms of education, Ireland, insulated on the island of the west of Europe, was allowed to flourish. And then from the 900s to the 1200 AD, around that time, we had Middle Irish. And then from the 12th century to the 18th century, we had early modern Irish. And now we have modern Irish, which is the Irish that we speak today. There are four distinct dialects of Irish. I speak probably the worst sounding dialect, which is Leinster dialect, but there's a dialect from Connacht, a dialect from Munster, and a dialect from Ulster. So I'll do my best not to butcher the language as we go through the rest of these slides. Now I want to talk a little bit about the language in relation to the history of Ireland. And I'm going to pick a very specific points to start here. And so we're in the Christian era, but we're also in the age of Vikings. So before the Vikings arrived, Irish or Gaeilge was the thriving vernacular of a deeply Gaelic society, and it was spoken across the island of Ireland. It was at this time rooted in Old Irish, but it was modern Irish at the time, but we would describe it as Old Irish today. And it flourished because of the monasteries and the royal courts and the legal courts as well. This was part of the reason why I love Brehon law. It's because we have the written word that we were able to make our mark in history. Because there's a lot of people out there, like a lot of tribal people, who never had they did have writing, but they never wrote down their records. They never had a written record. And so we have manuscripts that we can read today that talk about the laws of beekeeping, the laws of marriage, the laws of inheritance. And so there's so much body of work there, even just in the legal manuscripts, not to mention the poetry, not to mention the genealogies. And the epic sagas like the Tonbo Cooley or the Cattle Raid of Cooley. We have amazing mythologies. And most of these, or some of these, have been captured and illustrated in illuminated manuscripts. So Old Irish and Irish in general is a language of poetry, of law, of art, and was spoken as the daily language for millennia. And then in 795, the Viking raids began. they first sacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, which was a monastery that was set up by, established by Columcille. But then in 795, they sacked Lambay Island. This, over the centuries then, by the 9th century, they had eventually settled in places like Dublin, in Limerick, in Waterford, in Wexford. And they had set up like their basic society. Now, these Norse invaders, they established urban centres and trade centres, but they often clashed with the Gaelic lords. And over time, political intrigue and court affairs culminated in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where the High King Brian Boru, who was also named the Imperator, the Emperor of the Scoti, and that's interesting because originally the Irish people were called Scots. And so the reason why we call it Scotland today is originally the Picts were there, the people who were painting themselves blue. That's what we think because they didn't write anything down, so we don't know for sure. So in the northeast of Ulster and the western coast of Scotland, there was the same kingdom that circled these two lands, because on a clear day you can see you can see over to Scotland from the eastern coast of Ulster. There was a kingdom of Dalriada, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the Scots were the cousins of the Irish as we go through this presentation. But unfortunately, King Brian Boru, the Emperor of the Scoti, the Emperor of the Scots, he died in the Battle of Clontarf. He died in victory. And that was a very sad moment in our history, because there was potential there that he was going to, imagine it, right? They had just defeated the Vikings. There was a potential there that they would go on and continue to, help the Brits, the English, the Danish people had established a very stronghold in Britain. In Ireland, they only had the coastal towns, but in England, they had such power that you had like Saxony, okay? And there was a such thing called Danelaw in what was called Britain at the time. So it wasn't all bad. It wasn't like always fighting. I just live up the road from Skerries. And Skerries is a loan word from the Vikings. Munster, Ulster, Leinster, they're all loan words from the Vikings. The stir suffix comes from Scandinavian for state or tribe or people. And this woman who was on the tour, she said, I said, where are you going after this? Do you have any plans to go outside of Dublin? And she said, I'm going to go to Howth. And I was like, you mean Howth? She's like, no, Howth. Yeah, but it's pronounced Howth. And she said, oh, well, we pronounce H-O-W like how. And I said, okay, but it's actually a Viking word, I told her. I said, it's a Viking word that comes from Hoffod. And what's called in Irish is Bin Éidir, which means Aider's Peak. And Éidir is a personal name. And so then I continue to tell her the story of how Ireland's Eye, which is an island off the coast of Howth, came to be called that through a series of misunderstandings and misinterpretations. Because originally that island was called 𝐺𝑎𝑟𝑟, 𝐺ℎ𝑒𝑎𝑟𝑟, which Inish is the Irish for Ireland, island, and Iru is where we get Era, is where we get Ireland. So the Vikings, in their own tongue, were like, oh, 𝐺𝑎𝑟𝑟, so that's Ireland's I. But they were talking about the Viking word for island, which is I, which is the O with the line going through it and a Y. That's why you have a lot of places that have Viking names that end in AY, like Lambay Island. I think Lambay Island was originally called 𝐺𝑒𝑡𝑚gh by the Irish. So there was a lot of kind of cultural exchange going on here, intermarriage, because Brian Boru was actually married to the mother of the Viking king of Dublin, Sihtric Silkenbeard. So it wasn't as black and white as you might think. And it's an absolute disgrace that they didn't film any of the Vikings, the TV show, I mean, in Ireland, because they were very strong here. Ivar the Boneless was he was in Ireland. And we also have, apart from skerries, we also have words like marga, which is borrowed from the Norsemen, it's borrowed from the Vikings, and it means market. Or we have irid, which means errand. Now, jumping ahead now to the Anglo-Norman invasion. So in 1014, these guys were defeated, but they didn't, it wasn't the end of the Vikings. There were still hibernal Norsemen in the country. And then the Anglo-Normans invaded in 1169. Now, prior to this invasion, a papal bull was issued by the first and only ever English pope. And he issued that to King Henry II of England to be, quote, the Lord of Ireland. Now, the Lord of Ireland is not the King of Ireland. He didn't have that type of dominion. It was a legal title that came with certain privileges, benefits, and certain obligations, duties. And among those duties was the duty to promote the Roman version of Christianity and to collect a penny per hearth, or from every household, as tax to be paid to the Vatican. Now, why would the Vatican be doing that? It's interesting, and I actually have a video about this that I made several years ago called The Vatican, the Crown, and the Demise of the Brehon Law. And it kind of speculates that, you know, this goes back to the fall of the Roman Empire. After, once the Vatican was established, you had to get permission from the bishops or from the Pope to put a crown on another guy's head. So the Vatican became kind of the kingmakers. But the Irish didn't need that. They didn't need that permission. Why? Because the Irish had an unbroken tradition that predated the Vatican, going back thousands of years. And that was perceived as a threat by the Vatican. That's not all. Because the Irish monks were previously Druids, they retained some of this nature-based understanding of creation and of worship. And if you read the stories of the early Irish saints, you'll find a lot of examples of animals as their friends. For example, there's one saint that would read the Gospels, and a flea, who was his friend, would walk along the lines as he was singing, and then when he stopped singing, the flea would stop walking. There's another story about an otter that I can't remember exactly the details, I'd have to look it up, but essentially it was something like the monk's shoes fell into the water and the otter went in and got them and brought the shoes back. So there was this real close connection between nature and worship. That's not all. Because of the attitude towards women in the Brehon Law, which they were valued quite highly, they were not the property of the husband, for one. And another thing about the Brehon Law is that there was no death penalty. And, you know, English common law had a death penalty up until relatively recently in the grand scheme of things. And also, husbands could pretty much do what they want with their wives in the common law, English common law, because the court's seen that the wife is the property of the husband. But the first case that was ever heard in Ireland in the time of Partholón, so this is before the Tuatha De Danann, before the Nemedians, who came before the two-headed enemy. There was Partholonians. And this was the first reference to a court case in the mythology, if you went by the chronology. And the story is that Delgnat, who was the wife of Partholón, when Partholón was going out to survey the land, she, should I say, decided to play with her servant called Topa. And to add insult to this betrayal, Delgnat and Topa both drank from his sippy cup, Partholón's sippy cup. He had a golden straw. And when Partholón came back from his hunt or from surveying the land, he was very thirsty. So he called for his ale. And when he put the straw up to his lips, he just knew that the betrayal had taken place. And in a fit of rage, he killed Topa, but also, if that wasn't enough, Delgnat's beloved dog, Samir. And Delgnat took Partholón to court. And the judge, whose name we don't know, but the quote in the, I should say that Delgnat, the wife, said, "Partholón, leaving me alone is like leaving honey before a woman, milk before a cat, and tools before a smithy." Of course, when you have a situation like that, it's very hard to resist the temptation. So even back then, women were very good at using their wiles and ways to kind of get what they wanted, let's say. Now, because he had done that, because he had taken the law into his own hands, Partholón had no grounds to stand on. He had no defence. And the judgment was, and it was quoted in the 𝐺ℎ𝑒𝑎𝑟𝑟, the Book of Invasions, or the Book of the Takings of Ireland, that with very noble judgment and without deceit, it is the right of the wife to recover against the husband. Now, I'm telling you all this story just to juxtaposition the image that you're looking at here. This was painted by Daniel McAleese in 1854. And the building that you see smoking in the background is Christ Church Cathedral. And this is called the marriage of Strongbow and Aoife. And Aoife was the daughter of Dermot MacMurrough. So coming back to this papal bull that the first and only ever English Pope issued to Henry II, when Dermot MacMurrough was dispossessed of his lands for reasons by the High King Rory O'Connor and his allies, he then appealed to Henry II, who had the authority from the Pope, because there was no Protestants at this stage, to invade Ireland. And so Henry II didn't come by himself, but he did put it out to his nobles and his lords. And these very, let's say, entrepreneurial lords who had a taste for adventure. They were originally in Wales, but they didn't have a long history there because they were Anglo-Normans. And remember I mentioned the Vikings. Do you remember the TV show, The Vikings? And how tough they were and how always aggressive and they were always fighting. And that just goes to show that's probably why they didn't want to film it in Ireland, because we defeated them, to put it politely. So Aoife was the daughter of Dermot MacMurrough. And Strongbow, which he probably wasn't called that at the time, it just became a nickname later on. His name is Richard de Clare. He decided to take up the challenge, and he very quickly established control over Leinster, at areas of Leinster anyway, and it became known as the Pale, from the Latin palus, which means a stake, a prop, a wooden post. And yes, this is connected to the word phallus for obvious reasons. And so when you hear the phrase beyond the pale, it comes directly from this period and these actions. Why? Because the pale signified a barrier around civilized people, and outside of that barrier was the wild Irish. And if you were called beyond the pale, it meant you're literally like outside of civilized, you're a wild man. But we're going to learn in the next slide that the Irish weren't as wild or untamed or uncivilized, let's say, as this would make you think. So this is Christchurch Cathedral burning in the background, and Strongbow, Richard de Clare, is buried there. And this marks the beginning of the end of the well-established Gaelic order. And in the foreground on the left, you see the woman with the hands raised in the air, and she's standing beside the bard with the harp. And these are all the chieftains that have been slain, the Gaelic chieftains that have been slain. And it's very symbolic. And I really like this painting because the more you look, the more you see. Now, by the 13th and to 16th centuries, we had what we call a Gaelic revival, or in Irish, because this is about the Irish language, 𝐺ℎ𝑒𝑎𝑟𝑟 na Gaeilge, which means the reviving or reinvigorating of Irish. And that Irish also means Irish culture. And what happened in these centuries, in the 13th century, those Anglo-Norman lords, they went native. They began adopting Irish customs. They began wearing clothes like the Irish did. They began riding their horses like the Irish did. They began speaking Irish. And they became Níos Gailí ná na Gael féin, which is the Irish for more Irish than the Irish themselves. So when you hear names like Fitzgerald, like John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or Butler, or Barrett, or Burke, they are not originally Irish names. But we do consider them to be Irish names now because those people, those clans became Níos Gailí ná na Gael féin, more Irish than the Irish themselves. They were subsumed into our culture and our identity. And this cultural fusion sparked a Gaelic renaissance, especially in poetry and the bardic schools, and they would have been patrons to the Brehons, and very closely working with the Irish Church at the time. Now, you have the Statutes of Kilkenny here, because in response to this revival in 1361, Lionel of Antwerp had been sent as viceroy to Ireland by Edward III to recover his own lands because there was a bit of scuffle and his lands that were in Ulster had been taken back by the Irish, and he wanted to turn back the advancing tide of the Irish. So England's 1366 Statutes of Kilkenny were penned by Lionel of Antwerp. And he also held the titles of Duke of Clarence and Earl of Ulster, but that was a title that was given by Edward III. No, these statutes were enacted by a parliament in Kilkenny in 1366, hence the name, the Statutes of Kilkenny, and they desperately banned intermarriages, Irish speech, Irish modes of dress and hairstyles, because they just let their hair grow out. And when they were talking about the horse riding, to come back to that, what does Irish horse riding look like? Well, you just take the saddle off and you ride it bareback. And it decried how these English settlers had, quote, forsaking the English language and lived according to the manners of the Irish enemies. But perhaps the most unforgivable offence was that these now Hiberno-Norman lords, not Anglo-Norman lords, Hiberno-Norman lords, were abandoning their English courts and opted to resolve their disputes the Gaelic way. And what was the Gaelic way? By seeking the counsel of our learned and esteemed judges, or brehona, and that's the famous brehons from whom we get the term Brehon law. It was also stated in those statutes that if, quote, any of the aforementioned lords do the contrary, and thereof be attained, that he have the judgment of life and limb as a traitor to our Lord the King. And if I just want to read a part of the statute that's on the screen there, whereas at the conquest of the land of Ireland and for a long time after, the English of the said land used the English language, mode of writing, and apparel, and were governed and ruled, and their subjects called betags by the English law, in which time God and Holy Church and their franchises, according to their conditions, were maintained and themselves lived in subjection. But now, many English of the said land, forsaking the English language, fashion, mode of writing, laws, and usages, live and govern themselves according to the manners, fashion, and language of the Irish enemies, which is a line I just mentioned, and also have made diverse marriages and alliances between themselves and the Irish enemies aforesaid. So the good news is that was pretty ineffective. They just made this statute, but there was no means of enforcement. And then in defeat, Lionel of Antwerp went back to Britain in the year 1368. Now, fast forward 99 years after the Statutes of Kilkenny, a further decree was issued by Edward IV during a parliament in Trim, County Meath in 1465. And that said, of every Irishman dwelling within the Pale, which I mentioned earlier, which at this time included counties Dublin, Meath, Louth, and Kildare, should take an English surname, quote, of some town as Sutton, Chester, Trim, Skryne, Cork, Kinsale, or colour as white, black, brown, or art or science as smith or carpenter, or office as cook, butler, and that he and his issue shall use this name under pain of forfeiting his goods yearly till the premises be done. The premises they're talking about the adopting it a name that was better suited to the English tongue. To be levied 2 times by the year to the king's wars, according to the discretion of the Lord Lieutenant of the king or his deputy. Now, this is the reason why our Irish surnames, my name is Caoimhín O'Flanagan, as Gaeilge. It's been anglicised to Kevin Flanagan. Caoimhín is an Irish name. And this is why we have names like Smith or McGowan, which comes from McGowan, and it means son of the smith. Manchán Magan means son of the craftsman. And Ballinteer is Ballinteer, which means the town or the place of the craftsman. And that would anglicise to give us names like carpenter. Priest or taggart would be Manchán Sagart, would be the original Irish spelling and pronunciation, and it means son of the priest. O'Cleric gives us O'Clery or Cleary and is descendant of the cleric. O'Scoley, the descendant of the scholar. O'Hickey, the descendant of the healer. And incidentally, there is a lot of pharmacies in Ireland that are called Hickey's Pharmacy, so the tradition was never really broken. Manchán Ward is son of the bard, but has that special softening of the B, and that gives us a W sound. And Ward. So if you know any wards, they're originally the son of the bards. They're descendants of the bardic classes. There's also names like Duffy, which comes from dove, which means black or dark. Kira or O'Kerry means of the dark, the tribe of the dark ones. So I'm sharing these pieces of law to show you that there's been a concerted effort of the English and later British administration to suppress Irish identity by making us feel ashamed of our language, making us feel that we're barbarians, making us feel that, you know, we're uneducated. And we were not uneducated. We were highly educated. And we have the manuscripts to prove that. Now, moving on to the next section. Remember I mentioned the Scoti. Well, the last High King of Ireland was the brother of Robert the Bruce from Braveheart fame. His name was Edward Bruce. And between 1315 to 1318, he landed with 6,000 men and he engaged in a campaign of scorched earth invasion towards Dublin. And along that journey, he set fire to crops, and this eventually triggered a starvation. Now, here's the thing. He was invited in by the chieftains, by the Irish chieftains. And he was invited to be, actually they invited Robert the Bruce, but he had just defeated another King Edward of England. So he said, I don't really have time to do this. And I'm kind of tempted to go into a little bit more detail about this invasion, this scorched earth invasion that took place between 1315 to 1318. And when they got to Dublin, they were camping out in, I think, Rathmines area. When they got to Dublin, the news that the Scots were on their way reached the people of Dublin, who were at this stage living in the Pale. So you can imagine what they were like. And they panicked. And the city walls, which had fallen into disrepair, they decided to dismantle a church, take the bricks out of a church, and use those bricks to kind of refortify the wall. And they set fire to the Liberties, which is the area of the city outside of the city walls. But the catch was, that didn't really go according to plan, because the fire went over the city walls, and then the city is on fire. And so that prevented, they had the desired result of preventing Edward the Bruce from taking Dublin. And had he taken Dublin, had he succeeded in doing that, you would have had a situation where Scotland, the Isle of Man, were being ruled by Robert the Bruce, who had just defeated the King of England. And then you would have had Edward the Bruce as King of Ireland. And then they would have been able to mount a combined attack on the English forces. And history could have been very different. We could have had the Gaelic Isles, right? Or the Great Irish Isles of Britain and Ireland. Now, I could go into more detail, but there's a lot to get through, and I think I'll leave that for a future video. Now, moving on to the Great Famine on 𝐺𝑎𝑟, which I prefer to call it. This occurred between the years 1845 to 1852. And it happened because the potato crop failed. Now, the British have a very different understanding of this time. This often expresses itself in the ill-informed question of, well, if the potato crop was so bad, why didn't the Irish just go fishing? They were on in Ireland, weren't they? Or as the parody character Alan Partridge jokingly said, actually, I'm going to play that clip right now and take a bit of a breather because I have it lined up. Right. So I played that clip because I seen it recently, and I thought it was quite poignant for this presentation, just to kind of show you guys that this is an attitude that a lot of British people have. Now, he is making a joke. It is a parody character, so I can forgive him for that. But as I mentioned before, it's just from a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge. And the truth is, on 𝐺𝑎𝑟, which means the Great Hunger, saw 2 million Irish people die from hunger and starvation, and another 2 million people forced to emigrate, while they witnessed the bulk of their food, including livestock, crops, other vegetables, because believe it or not, folks, Ireland is a very fertile island. And it was only the potatoes that failed. We had knowledge and we were growing all different sorts of food here. And in recent years, there are ship manifests that have been discovered that document the quantities of food that were being exported at gunpoint to feed the soldiers of the British Empire overseas so that they could be well fed while they're oppressing the native people of other lands. So many Irish today refuse to acknowledge it was a genuine famine. And time again, when I mention the famine, I'll get comments saying it wasn't a famine, it was a genocide. Like, I don't know that, you know? And I don't need to be told again and again and again. Even when I put a caveat, like, look, I'm just saying, I know it wasn't a famine, I know it was a genocide, or at least it was ethnic cleansing. I will always get somebody in the comments who thinks that, yeah, that they know more than I know. And perhaps they do on certain topics, but I don't need to be told that it wasn't a famine. I know it wasn't a famine. It was much more complex and nuanced than that. And during this time where 2 million people died and 2 million people left the country, it left rural communities decimated. There's mass graves in this country, and it's a very dark part of our history that I don't think we've come to terms with it when you consider that it was, what, 250 years ago? Oh, 1920, yeah, about 200 years ago, 180 years ago. Um, so yeah, I mean, Irish was decimated by this event. And it was at this stage where, because Irish people wanted to emigrate to America where they only spoke English, or to the UK in a lot of cases, or to other countries, um, learning English was seen as a survival mechanism. It was a way to survive and a way to get ahead in the new world. Now, I want to go back. So that was in 1845, another man-made famine. Okay. I want to go back now to 1601, the early 17th century, very early 17th century. And this is when the Battle of Kinsale took place. Another very defining moment in Irish history. Now, the people who were involved with this were Chieftain Hugh O'Neill and O'Donnell. And this Battle of Kinsale took place from October 1601 to January 1602. And it took place during the 9 Years' War in Ireland, where English forces under Lord Mountjoy defeated an alliance of Irish Gaelic lords and Spanish troops. If any of you have seen the recent interview that I did with Mícheál Ó Dúil, we talk about this, and he informed me that it wasn't just that the Spanish landed in the wrong place. They landed in Kinsale. They were supposed to land in Ulster. It was also that the general of the Spanish troops was saying to Hugh O'Neill, you go over to the hill there and we'll cover you. And that never happened. It's just a mystery of history, you know, that perhaps, you know, these Catholic allies were more aligned to the Vatican than to the Irish, but that's just me speculating. Now, a few short years after this, in 1607, we had the flight of the Earls, or in Irish, Imacht na nGaedheal. I'm sorry, I'm butchering that pronunciation. And this happened in September the 14th in 1607. And these were two key Ulster lords. Now, today we think of the North, Ulster, as Northern Ireland, and we think of it as being mostly Protestant because of the loyalists that are there. up until this happened, up until this time, Ulster was the most Gaelic province on the land, on the island of Ireland. There was no comparison because they were the last ones to bend the knee. They were the last ones to bend the knee. And the guy on the right there, he's Hugh O'Neill. He was educated by a British family, an English family in Dublin. And he went up and he completely revolutionized the Irish army, his forces, and he turned them into a very strong and efficient fighting force. And he began to wear Irish customs, speak the Irish language, and he began to kind of become a propaganda figure for the Gaelic revival, for Irish culture. And these two were Catholics at the time, because I guess the efforts of Henry II and all of these years of they landed on the island in 1167. So from then till now, they had really worked on the Irish, and there's a whole other tangent I could go into here about the Synod of Whitby. But once they accepted that they were Catholic, they kind of used it for political expediency because they realized that they could have allies with the Catholics of continental Europe, Catholic France and Catholic Spain. And so I don't know how much they were Catholic or not, but they used it as a for political advantage. And so when they left, it left a power vacuum in Ulster and in Ireland, actually. It was the beginning of the decline of the old Gaelic order and way of life. It was probably the most significant, and I know I've said that a few times, but I'm only pointing out some very significant aspects of our Irish history. And this created a power vacuum that led to land confiscations and the Protestant plantation of Ulster and all of Ireland, which saw the dispossession of Catholics from their land, and this sowed long-term grievances. And here's a map of the plantations. And I want you to look at the orange thing, the orange shape just beside Dublin and Leinster there, the dark orange. That's Laois and Offaly, or parts of Laois and Offaly, which were then at that time called King's County and Queen's County. And the king was James I, and the queen was, I believe, Elizabeth I. And then I want you to see the orange, same color orange up at Enniskillen in Ulster. That was the first Ulster plantation, and also just above Belfast there as well. And then after 1602 is the light orange colours. There was also plantations in Munster, and that's where you had the Munster rebellions and uprisings. And the green was Connacht, and that was the lands reserved for Irish people. Why? Because if you've ever been to Connacht, you know that that is pretty poor land. And that's why in that part of the country, you'll find miles and miles and miles of stone walls, dry stone walls. Because it was around this time, especially 1645, I believe, the Cromwellian campaign began in Ireland. And Cromwell allegedly, famously said, "To hell or to Connacht." And he turned Drogheda, just up the road from me, into a bloodbath. It was, from the accounts that I've read, it was literally rivers of blood running down the streets. And as he was killing these people, he would say, "To hell or to Connacht." This was also during the Penal Laws. These were a set of laws that were measures to codify and protect the Protestant dominance, the Protestant ascendancy, by restricting the Catholic rights to own their own land and to educate their children in the way that they would like to have been, to have control over the education of their own children. They were banned from holding public office and from worship. Now, this really picked up pace from 1695 onwards. But the early precursors began just as those earls crossed over the horizon into the distance and out of sight. As early as 1607, there was precursors. And there is a list of some of these penal laws on the screen there. But I do have another list here. So Catholics could not serve in public office. And when I say Catholics, I mean native Irish. Catholics and Protestants could not intermarry. Catholics could not own firearms. Catholics could not vote. Catholics could not inherit land. Catholics could not adopt orphan children. Catholics could not receive an education. They were not allowed to acquire a life annuity policy, so that's life insurance. They were deprived of the right to vote. I mentioned that. But worse, perhaps the even worse than this, if that wasn't bad enough, they were not allowed to possess a horse that could be used in battle. And a battle horse cost more than £5. So they couldn't sell a horse for more than £5. Otherwise, they would be admitted to having a battle ready horse. And this is the reason why Art O'Leary, from the famous poem The Queena of Art O'Leary, which Queena means to cry, to mourn or lament, because he didn't sell his horse to an Englishman who wanted his horse because it was a great horse. So building on these post-flight plantations and later upheavals such as the 1641 rebellion, the Cromwellian conquest, which I already mentioned, the laws entrenched socio-economic divides after the William White Wars of 1689 to 1691. And these laws exploited this Catholic defeat and continued to dispossess their lands for over a century. These penal laws were in direct violation of the 1691 Treaty of Limerick, which had granted Catholics religious freedom and equality. Now, they did not come to a complete end until the Emancipation Act of 1829. So from 1607 to 1829. And this was largely achieved by the emancipator, the great man, Daniel O'Connell. So these were, fair to say, pretty draconian laws. And they were specifically targeting Catholic majorities and Protestant sympathizers, okay? And the famed Irish philosopher whose statue stands outside Trinity College, Edmund Burke, he described the penal laws as a machine of wise and elaborate contrivance, as well fitted for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people, and the debasement in them of human nature itself, as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, this was coupled with another cruel and unusual punishment called the bat score, and that's Irish for the scoring stick. This was the period when, okay, so the scoring stick was a piece of wood that if you spoke English in school, or if you were heard speaking English, you would be ordered to put a mark on that stick. And the parents of that child who spoke English or who spoke Irish would be required to beat the children. And this is probably where the deep, deep shame comes from. Also the famine, many famines. Imagine how degraded you have to be in your own mind to beat your own child for speaking their own language. This was the era that completely shattered the intergenerational transmission of Irish language, Irish culture, and this was pretty much the darkest period for the Irish language. How cruel How barbaric, how mean does an administration have to be to punish a person for speaking their own language, and we can't even think in our own language? We can't even curse the bastards in our mind because we don't have the words to do it. Now, this is leading on to the next part, which I have called the Road to Independence, 1798 Irish Rebellion, or Éirí Amach, Seacht Géad Déag Nóga a Hocht, which means rise out. Amach is out. Éirí is to rise. So the 1798 rebellion is a pretty interesting one because it was orchestrated by the Society of United Irishmen. And who were they? They were an underground Republican group founded in 1791 by figures like Theobald Wolfe Tone and Thomas Russell. And they were inspired by the American and French revolutions. And the whole thing about the United Irishmen was that it was uniting the Catholics and the Protestants and the Catholics under one banner of United Irishmen who all wanted to fight for Ireland to be its own independent nation, in charge of its own affairs and in charge of its own destiny. So these were kind of aiming, this United Irishmen were aiming for a non-sectarian Irish Republic. And it saw uprisings in Ulster, Leinster and Wexford, with the Battle of Vinegar Hill, which is the picture that you're seeing on screen now, which was the brutal climax. 20,000 rebels clashed with British forces, resulting in heavy defeats. Now, Vinegar Hill is an interesting one because what's that in Irish? It's, well, Knock is the Irish for hill, but vinegar, it doesn't really make sense. When you look at the Irish, it makes a lot of sense because it's Fia Nagar, which means the hill of the wood of the berries, or the hill of berry wood. But 18th century English speakers heard this and said, oh, it kind of sounds like vinegar or vinegar. And they misinterpreted it and they anglicized it as Vinegar Hill. This hill was a glacial mound rising 137 meters over Enniscorthy in County Wexford, and it served as a rebel encampment in 1791, where up to, as I mentioned before, 20,000 United Irishmen were defeated by British forces on June the 21st. Now, this is a more colourful depiction of the Battle of Vinegar Hill, which is known colloquially in Ireland as the longest day, just to give you an idea that this probably raged, felt like forever. And speaking about this particular painting, the artist Martin O'Sullivan said that he loves history, but always felt world history was better documented than our own Irish history. We had all the stories here, but very few pictures or illustrations. And that's the point. We had a lot of stories, but not a lot of illustrations or pictures. And I find a lot of difficulty when I'm trying to make these presentations, not so much anymore with AI, because I can just put in the picture that I want and it pops out all of these beautiful images that I can choose from. But Martin O'Sullivan said he wanted to add some colour to this part of history, and he aimed to be as accurate and true to history as possible, down to the clothing, the emblems, the weaponry, and people in attendance, such as Father Murphy upon his white horse. Now, if you're looking, where's the white horse? Well, do you see this kind of windmill up on the hill? Looks like a tower. And just in front of that, you see a little white horse, and that's Father Murphy, and that's his white horse. Now, Martin O'Sullivan said that this was from an article that I got from a few years ago, so maybe he did realize his ultimate dream was to have this painting displayed somewhere publicly to be seen by people young and old, and used as a tool for education and awareness of our heritage. So the reason I share this image with you is because he is a man like me, like he's just motivated by the love of our heritage to educate other people about our heritage and our history. Now we have Easter Rising, 1916, Éirí Amach na Cásca, which means rise out of Easter, or the Easter Rising. So on Easter Monday, April 24th, about 1,200 volunteers, Irish Citizen Army members, and Fianna Éireann Scouts seized key Dublin sites, including the General Post Office, or GPO, and this was where Pádraig Pearse read the proclamation of the Irish Republic, declaring sovereignty and equality for all its citizens, and declaring the Irish Republic as a sovereign independent state. That's the GPO in the background there, the General Post Office. Bullet holes can still be seen in the pillars to this day. And I don't know if you can see there, but the top windows, basically it's been gutted. Now, only 1,200 people in a population of millions volunteered to do this, to make this great sacrifice. It was coordinated by the Irish Republican Brotherhood's Military Council, and it included signatories like Pádraig Pearse, who I just mentioned, James Connolly, who's on the bottom left, Tom Clark, who's the man in the top middle, Sean McDermott, Joseph Plunkett on the bottom right, Eamon Cant, and Thomas MacDonagh. This uprising only lasted 6 days. But the men who were doing this, they knew that they were going to die. In fact, Pádraig Pearse has writings, because he was quite prolific at writing, where he compares the sacrifice of Irish blood to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And he said something like, just as mankind has been redeemed by the blood of the sacrifice of Christ, so Ireland will be redeemed by the blood of the sacrifice of Irishmen. And when you read his writings, they're awfully sad. I find them sad anyway, because it's like they're just kind of a portent that he knew what was going to happen. British forces, with their artillery support, began bombarding the city, and they caused 250 rebel and 116 civilian deaths. What they did was they drove with their like armored boats up the Liffey and began shooting shells at this building that you see in the background. And they took positions along Henry Street, on Talbot Street, just across from where the Spike is now, with cannons and heavy artillery. So these 15 leaders, plus Roger Casement, who was responsible for the Howth gun running, which failed, they were court-martialed and ordered to be executed, often by firing squad at dawn. And this act was the act that ignited the passion and the fire for outrage against the British. And Sinn Féin, the political organisation, the old Sinn Féin, not the new Sinn Féin, at the time before this, before they were executed, their support was at 1.5%, negligible. After this, in the 1918 election, 32 county election, it jumped to 73%. I would call that a landslide. So the Easter Rising profoundly boosted the Irish language revival, and especially because leaders like Padraig Pearse, who was a Gaelic League co-founder, he was an educator, I think St. Enda's was the name of his school, and he was a poet. He integrated Irish language into the kind of the zeitgeist of republicanism and into the nationalist cause. And this accelerated cultural efforts post 1916. So, for example, Pearse is the man, excuse me, who wrote the poem 𝐺ℎ𝑎𝑚, which means in Irish, I am Ireland. And he also famously said, 𝑇𝑒𝑎𝑛 𝐺ℎ𝑎𝑛𝑔𝑎, 𝐺𝑒𝑎𝑛 anam. A land without a language is a land without a soul. Now, this is a close-up of a part of the Proclamation of Independence, the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic to the people of Ireland. And I want to point out a few things. Notice that it's addressed to both Irish men and Irish women. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? And pretty unheard of at the time. And I would put money on the fact that that was because of how women were viewed under the Brehon Law. It was embedded into the psyche of Irish people that women were just as important as men. In the name of God and of the dead generations from which she received her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. This, okay, I know that there's always it's always customary to refer to a country as either a male or a female. But why did they refer to Ireland as a female? Because it's always been referred to as a female. Because back in the day, the goddess was land. The land was a goddess. And the goddess was always the goddess of sovereignty. And that's why, in order to be inaugurated as a king, you had to go through a ceremonial marriage to the goddess of sovereignty. That's why we call it Éire, because we're naming it after the goddess Iru. In poetry, it's also called Banda and Fola, and these were the three sisters. So it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that they are referring to the island as a female. And then having organized and trained her manhood through her secret revolutionary organizations. That's interesting because now you're introducing the other side, the yang to the yin. But she had to train for that. She had to train for her manhood. Now I have all of the proclamation here in my notes, but I don't want to do that because I feel like I've been talking for too long and I see that I still have a good few slides to get through. One thing I want to point out is the use of the word nation here. At a later paragraph, it says, the Irish Republic is entitled to and hereby claims the allegiance of every Irish man and Irish woman. Okay. And in the same paragraph, a couple of lines later, it says, pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and all of its parts, cherishing all of the children of the nation equally and oblivious of the differences carefully fostered by an alien government. Now, I want to emphasize this word nation because what were they thinking when they used that word nation? I put it to you that what they meant was what nation actually means. A race of people, a large group of people with common ancestry and language. And it comes from the word nation in Old French, which is birth, rank, descendants, relatives, country or homeland. And this is directly from the Latin nationum. Nominative is natio, and that means birth, origin, breed, stock, kind, species, race of people, tribe. They're talking about the Irish race, the Irish nation. So this sowed the seeds for what would come next. the War of Independence, or in Irish, Cogadh na Saoirse. This was ignited on January 21st, which is unofficially Ireland's Independence Day in 1919, when the first Dáil Éireann, Sinn Féin elected assembly, because remember they got 70% in the 32 county election. They convened in Dublin's Mansion House and ratified the Republic proclaimed in 1916, and they rejected British partition proposals. This was led by a famous man, a mighty man, IRA commander, Michael Collins. Now, the conflict was a classic guerrilla war. There was a lot of ambushes, assassinations targeting British intelligence, and boycotts against the Royal Irish Constabulary. And they became so frequent that the British forces retaliated, and there was brutal reprisals from a group called the Black and Tans. And the reason they were called that was because of the uniforms that they wore. And another group called the Auxiliaries. They were auxiliary police force, auxiliary police. And these people, both the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries, were notorious for looting and terror. So I'm living in North County Dublin. And the town that I'm living in was sacked by the Black and Tans. And it's still remembered. There's pictures of this town that look a little bit like the picture that you're looking at here. Maybe not as much destruction as that. But it's still remembered. And there was two men who were assassinated, shot in cold blood by the Black and Tans. And there's a plaque on the bridge down in the middle of the town. And it says, I think, Shane Lawless and Seamus. I think the surnames are definitely correct. Lawless and Gibbons. Probably Shane Lawless and Seamus Gibbons. And it says, like, close to this spot where you're standing. It was so bad that the people of the town, which was a village at the time, sought refuge and hid themselves in the hay bales of the neighboring fields, because there's a lot of fields around at the time. So over 1,400 people died in this asymmetric fighting across rural Ireland, with urban centres like Cork seeing widespread destruction, and obviously Dublin as well. Now, a truce was signed on July the 11th, 1921, which ended the hostilities, but it created the seeds for deepening divides over compromise. And if you want to read more or learn more about this period of history, there's plenty of books that you can get, and I would really encourage you to do your own research on this, because it's really fascinating. And during this time, the British, with their propaganda machine, sought to suppress the Irish language as a symbol of resistance. But this just backfired, and it only strengthened Irish people's resolve and the Irish language's role in nationalist propaganda, and really fueled community solidarity, especially in Gaeltacht areas. Now, this is the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. It was negotiated in London's Downing Street from October to December amid tense secrecy. The man sitting in the middle looking down is Michael Collins. And Michael Collins was not a diplomat. He was a military man. And it's a mystery of history why he was sent to negotiate. He quipped that while he was negotiating, it was like a pistol was to our heads. He was there with Arthur Griffith, who's the man on the left with the glasses, and George Gavin Duffy for Sinn Féin. And the On the English side, you had David Lloyd George, David Lloyd George, David Lloyd George for Britain. Now, upon signing the treaty, it's alleged that Michael Collins said he just signed his own death warrant. And that man up there, it's not Sir Nichols, even though he looks a spitting image of him because I think they're first cousins. But I want to draw your attention to the signatures on this page, especially this one here, Micheál O'Collins. And that turned out to be true. He did sign his death. It marked the beginning of the end of Michael Collins' life. Two things happened as a result of this treaty. The Free State, Irish Free State, was created, and a new state called Northern Ireland was also created. So while it ended the War of Independence by creating the Free State as a self-governing dominion in the British Commonwealth with control over 26 counties, its own army, and fiscal autonomy, it also partitioned Northern Ireland. The 6 Protestant majority counties, which were a Protestant majority because of the plantations. This part of the country that you're looking at now, as I mentioned a few slides ago, where the flight of the Earls happened, this was once the most Gaelic part of the country. This is where Cuchulainn, the mighty Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, lived and roamed. So this became Northern Ireland, a British entity, which immediately opted out via the treaty itself. What that means is there was a clause within the treaty that allowed for an opting out. And the treaty contained a lot of controversial clauses, such as an oath of allegiance to the British monarch, and this was seen as a kind of a fig leaf of subservience, and continued British naval basing rights at key ports until 1924. This was narrowly ratified by the Dáil Éireann, 64 in favour and 57 against. And that was ratified on January the 7th, 1922, which ignited bitter splits between what then became the pro-treaty forces, viewing it as a pragmatic step towards freedom, and anti-treaty forces who seen it as a betrayal of the republic that they were fighting and many men dying for. And this ultimately sparked a civil war, which lasted between 1921 or 1922 to 1923. So it was pretty short. So the war began when the provisional government, which were the pro-treaty forces, shelled, this is the 4 courts in Dublin. And the reason why they started firing on the 4 courts in Dublin is that the 4 courts had been occupied by the anti-treaty IRA forces. They rejected the treaty and the oath, and De Valera described it as this criminal lunatic asylum attack. This really marked the pro-treaty side's aggressive bid for control in the wake of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And pro-treaty forces under Collins and Griffith, bolstered by all the British arms that they were getting, they quickly secured cities. But the conflict, as quick as it started, it also as quickly devolved into guerrilla warfare, especially in the west, Connacht and Munster. And there was ambushes, there was train hijackings, and reprisal killings, mirroring the recent independence struggle. But the thing is, I remember hearing about this in history in school, and there was things people were saying it was brother against brother, father against son. And this is a close-up of that gate, but from a different angle. and this was the entrance to the forecourts. So very soon after this, the anti-treaty leaders like Eamon de Valera, who renounced violence but kind of still supported the IRA, he faced his own internal rifts, while pro-treaty executions of captured fighters, 77 in total, without trial, drew condemnation. These were their own countrymen, and they were doing it to themselves. So it was appalling what they had been driven to do, or what they chose to do, um, for power. The war's human cost, even though it was only a year, was 1,500 dead. Ireland has a pretty small population, especially since the famine, like relatively small. That might not seem like a lot to Americans or to Canadians, but to Irish people it was significant. And among the 1,500 dead was the man who I mentioned a moment ago, called Michael Collins. He was ambushed and assassinated on August the 22nd, 1922 at Ballinablaw in County Cork. Now the war, that didn't end the war, unfortunately, but it did formally end on May the 24th, 1923, when IRA Chief of Staff, so the anti-treaty IRA, Frank Aiken, issued a ceasefire order conceding military defeat amid public war weariness. And this left scars that would shape Irish politics for decades to come. And I mean decades to come. The Civil War disrupted society, but it did not halt Irish language initiatives. The Free State government persisted with mandatory Irish in schools from 1922, viewing it as an essential to national identity despite the turmoil. And in the 1922 Constitution, they also enshrined that Irish should be the first and primary language of the country. And I'm happy to say that that's still the case in today's Constitution, which was published in 1937 and it's been amended since then. Irish is still the first and primary language of the country, and English is also an official language, but it's a secondary language. I'm just going to see if there's any questions in the chat box, if I can. Wow, a lot of people. Okay. Right, I'm going to actually look at the questions after, because there's a lot of comments and I just want to make sure I get to all of them. I'm going to take a sip of water because I feel like I've been talking for a long time and I have to clear my throat. Now we're nearly finished. This next section is shorter. Okay, so how is Irish being used today? Well, I'm happy to say in recent years, Irish has gone through a bit of a renaissance. And it wasn't due, I'm also happy to say, that it wasn't due to any government programs, but the sheer will of the people to love their language and to love speaking it for the sake of their language, for the sake of speaking Irish, for the sake of speaking Irish. If any of you are on TikTok, you will be aware that, and if you're looking for these videos, Irish speaking TikTok is vibrant. And there's a lot of things happening in the pop culture as well, like kneecap, um, and who rap in Irish and English, and other bands as well, like Inlay, who I kind of prefer, because their music is much more, I would say, like much more broader, and they only sing in Irish. There's a few English words, but then they only sing in Irish. And I'm going to see them on the 29th of December. They're playing in the Grand Social, and you can still get tickets. And I would encourage you, if you really want to get exposed to your language, then to go to events like this. I was just at an event, was one of the singers of Imlay, where I was advertised that it was a concert. So I was expecting that she was going to be on stage or whatever, but it was just like a quiet room in a pub, upstairs in a pub, and everybody was singing songs. I didn't sing any songs because uh, ní isagum Gaeilge alán agus ní isagum Gaeilge Aran Gaeilge, which means I didn't sing these songs because I don't know a lot of Irish and I don't know Irish songs. Um, but it was really cool because it was like a pop-up Gael talk. And what's a pop-up Gael talk, you might ask? It's basically events where people just go and speak Irish to each other, and you don't even have to have fluent, you don't even have to be um, fluent. You can just go and use your cúpla focal, and if you have a cúpla focal, you learn a cúpla more. Um, Gael schools, which are Irish-speaking schools, they now have waiting lists, which is great. And I wonder if it's got anything to do with the fact that we've had a huge influx of immigrants in the last 10, 20 years. And that's after making Irish people kind of look at themselves and go, huh, they have their own, like, they have their own Polski slip, they have their own Polski sklep, and they have their own, like, Afro-Caribbean hairdressers, and they have their own restaurants, you know. I want to connect with my own identity. That's just what I think anyway. There might be an element of truth to that. I'm not too sure. But Níl sé bás, tá sé bio. It's not dead, it's alive. It's not like Latin. And I know Latin is still spoken, but people call Latin a dead language. Have I frozen? I think my batteries are after going. Okay, just pause. Just pause. And I'm going to change the battery in the camera. It shouldn't take too long. Just keep chatting amongst yourselves there in the chat box, please. Right. Okay, I think you can still hear me anyway, but I just want to make sure that the camera is working. Right. Okay. Bear with me, folks. Mhm. Okay. Right. Sorry about the delay. Mm. Okay, I'm back. Okay. Yep. Perfect. So as I was saying, it's not a dead language like Latin, even though Latin is still spoken, and even though Latin is kind of the basis for English and the Romance languages, it's very alive. But despite what I just said about the revival, it's on life support. So Ireland is on the list of endangered lang Irish is on the list of endangered languages. And I'm showing you these road signs here just to bring to your attention that Irish is still around, it's still there, and it's alive. Ach fós tá sé beo agus slán, but still it is alive and well. And I just want to point out to you some of the meanings of these words. Um, some of the meanings of the place names, should I say. So Lis Dún Bhearna, Lis is a fort, Lis is a stone, should I say, Dún is a fort, and Bhearna is the gap. Ross Come on is a personal name, and Ross means forest. So on Rush agus Luasca, as you always hear on the trains when you're going either direction on the northern commuter from Dublin, that means forest. And the tuathail on the left top left let me get this right. The top left photo, but the top right arrow says list tool or list towel. Well, lis is the same as what I've just mentioned there. It's a stone. And tuathail comes from the word tuatha, and it's also where we get the surname Tool. So if you're called O'Toole, you are a noble, you are the head of the tuatha, the tua, and so it's the stone of the tools. And what was the joke I heard? How do you know God finished his work in Wicklow? Because he left a lot of tools behind, and that's a joke for people in the know that there's a lot of all the O'Tooles come from Wicklow, or a lot of O'Tooles are in Wicklow. So bit of a stupid joke, but anyway. Béal Átha Longfort. Well, Longfort is actually a borrowed word from Norse, and Béal Átha, it means like the mouth of the ford. Same way you have Béal Feirste, that's the mouth of the river Feirste. Galway or Gaillimh means stony because it was named after the river in Abhainn na Gaillimhe, which is also called River Corrib. And it just means stony. Or no, yeah, it means stony. Inish Diamon means Inish means island, and Diamon is a personal name, which would probably be Damien in in English. And the one below that, Lahinch on Lacht, that actually means a grave. So when you see Tala, Tallaght, in Irish, it's on 𝑐eolacht, which means the plague grave. And that goes back to a legend of the Nemedians, who were the people who were between the Tuatha De Danann and before the Tuatha De Danann and after the Partholonians. This is what I mean about like our country, our place names are screaming out with their stories to be heard. Tralee means the Tra means like a beach or a coast, and Lee is the River Lee. Awan Mór means the big river. Awan Beg means the little river. So not only is the land screaming at us to tell stories, once we start listening and once we start like paying attention to what the stories are, we can start to understand the uses of the land, the battles that took place here, the people that lived there. Like Tyrone is Tir Own, and that literally means Owen's country or the land of Owen's descendants. And what we now call Donegal, which in Irish is Dún na nGael, which means fortress of the foreigners, used to be called Tir Connell because Owen and Connell were descendants of Niall of the Nine Hostages, Niall ní Ghealach. And this was their Donegal. So you can see it in this map actually, and the next map. Donegal is, well, you can see it there, and Tir Connell, or should I say Tyrone, is kind of where the U and the L is of Ulster. Now, through centuries of invasion, famine, oppression, Irish language faded from Manchán Magan, from the Irish people or the people of Ireland. But we still have it. It's still there. It's still burning like a little flame. And all it requires like all of Irish heritage. All it requires is a passionate heart and an open mind to adopt the mind of a student and to be prepared to blow on those embers until a fire starts. So even though it's gone through these centuries of invasion and famine and oppression and so many other things, hard history have we had in Ireland, and our songs attest to that, the sad music that we play. But it has also gone through several revivals, like the Gaelic revival of the 1300s to the 13th to the 16th century that I just mentioned, the revival during the 1916 period, and today we have Conradh na Gaeilge, which put on the event that I mentioned a moment ago with the lead singer from Imlay, or the singer from Imlay, to modern Gael talks, pop-up Gael talks. There's one happening in Swords at the last Wednesday of every month. That's not too far from where I live. So I've already made plans with my friends to 𝐺𝑒, my friends to go to that. And even though I don't have enough Irish to have a conversation as 𝐺𝑒 fluently, I want to make an effort to honor this resilient tongue. And you see the green area there around Connemara and up around top of Mayo, that reflects back to that policy of Cromwell, where he said 𝑇𝑒𝑎𝑟 to Connacht. So a lot of those areas, the green areas, they were untouched by British rule. And if you look at the very top there, Tory Island, that has been speaking Irish forever. And this is a map of the concentration of Irish speakers today. Okay. Now, obviously, there's not going to be a lot of them in Ulster, or in the part of Ulster that was predominantly Protestant. And I've asked Groch for the figures. So if it's wrong, you can blame you can blame Groch. But it said, I asked a question like, what are the percentage of Irish people of people who can speak Irish in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland? And Groch said the percentage who can speak Irish is 40% of the population aged 3 and over. That's 1.87 million people, 1.87 and change million people out of approximately 4.68 million and a bit of change. So that makes up 40%. But when asked the question, do you speak Irish on a daily basis? That 40% drops to 1.5%. It's a huge drop. And that's population of over three years of age and over. 1.5% of the population is less than 72,000 people speak it on a daily basis. So that's why I say, if you have a cúpla focal, use a cúpla more and try to use it on a daily basis. And when you get asked that question the next time on the census, I didn't ever fill in the census, but anyway, if you fill in the census and you see that question, say that you do. If you do, don't lie, especially not in the census. But let's try and get that 1.5 number up. Let's make it higher. Let's make it like 2.5 and then 5% and then 10% and then 50%. And then 100% of the people in Ireland are speaking Irish on a daily basis. But what about Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, let's say? Up there, the percentage of people who can speak Irish is 10.4% of the population. That's 190,506 people out of 1.83 million people and a bit of change. Now, the percentage of Irish speakers on a daily basis up there is 2.4% of the population, which only works out, I shouldn't say only, it works out as 43,500 among those who speak the language. When asked the question, some ability of Irish, that number jumps up to 12.4%. Now, I want to take you back here a little bit to This is the old money. Some of you will probably remember this money before the Euros. I certainly do. I remember getting a £5 note from my grandparents or my uncle, and I felt like I was rich. And you were rich with £5 in your wallet or your pocket back then. Um, Now, the reason I use this picture is because it's illustrating the use of Irish today, and I zoomed in because I wanted to draw attention to the Irish that's written on the board. In the next presentation that I'll do, a follow-up presentation in part two, I'm going to show you the Irish alphabet. And yes, it's based on the Latin alphabet or the Roman alphabet, but we have our own characters for certain letters. Um, and this is a poem called Mise Raftery an Fili, which means I am Raftery the poet. And I'm going to read that now in a moment. But the policy of mandatory Irish as a compulsory subject in Irish schools persisted well beyond the Civil War era, I'm happy to say. And with Irish enshrined in the 1922 Constitution as the official language, it integrated into the curriculum for primary level students and upwards. Now, that would have been great if it wasn't for, in 1973, then Minister for Education Richard Burke, which is a Norman name, but we'll forgive him for that, abolished the requirement to pass Irish examinations to qualify for the intermediate certificate, which is now the junior certificate, and leaving certificate. So this made passing Irish as an optional subject for secondary level certification, and that kind of eased the pressure on students while the subject itself remained compulsory. It may not still be now, but it was compulsory for members of the Bar Society, the police force, the defence forces to be able to speak Irish. And you have a right to be addressed by the government through Irish, through Gaeilge. But I've heard stories of people who tried that and they an Australian man who loved the Irish language and was having a bit of bother with a police officer. He decided that he would speak Irish, and the police officer kind of used force against him. So, which is sad to say because it's our native tongue, it's our national language, and it's sad that you can't speak it on the street. And now we're hiring Gardaí who are not native Irish and certainly didn't learn Irish in school. At least I don't think they did. So yeah, that's a bit sad that they decided to make it not obligatory to pass it, but they kind of kept it for things like the police force and so on. Now this drew mixed reactions, especially from nationalists like those from Gaeilge. They welcomed the potential teaching reforms, and the language freedom movement celebrated the end of enforced passing. But it was just kind of like a weak move, I think, on the Minister for Education. I think they were kind of pandering to pressure from these different organizations. And for example, through 1971, the primary school curriculum was reduced the allocated hours from around 200 to 140 per year. And this just reflects a gradual softening rather than an outright change. Now, today, I'm happy to say Irish is still a core subject in the primary education, and also in secondary education, but just there's not as much of a requirement to pass. So you don't fail your leaving cert if you fail Irish. And there's a growing emphasis on what I mentioned before, Gael schooling, pop-up Gael talks and so on, which is immersion. So this is the poem that was on the board. I found the full poem and I'd like to read that for you, for you now. Mise Raftery an Fili. Is Mise Raftery an Fili, Lán Dúchas is gra, le Súla gan solas. le cúnas gan crá, ag dul siar meastar, le solas mo chrí, fáin agus thuirseach, go deireadh mo chlí. Féach anis mé, is mo cúil le bhaile, ach sinnam ceol, ag sinnam ceol, the folky full of. Am Raftery the Poet, full of hope and love, with eyes without sight. And the correct translation is actually le súla gan solas, eyes without light. Calm, untroubled, going west on my journey, by the light of my heart, weary and tired. To the end of my road, behold me now, with my back to the wall, playing music to empty pockets. We also retained the use of Gaeilge in Irish politics. So if there are any international people watching and going like, why did I call the Prime Minister of Ireland the Taoiseach? Why did I call the Deputy Prime Minister the Taoiseach? Why did I call the Parliament Oireachtas? Well, these all come from, apart from the last word, Seanad, Taoiseach comes from the Irish for chieftain. And I've used a picture of Micheál Martin. This is an old presentation. And do you remember Micheál Martin said that the Irish people are not a homogenous group of people? Not that long ago, I made a video about it, condemning him for saying it. But he's going to use the title of chieftain. I'm so offended by this, man. I just want to move on. Taoiseach refers to the custom of tanistry, which was basically, there wasn't just one royal family and they didn't have primogeniture, which is the eldest born male would inherit the title of the father. It was open to all of the eligible males. So your cousins, your uncles, and your brothers, eligible males only. And the reason that was done was to prevent inter-clan disputes in the event of the chieftain's death. So it was a clever way of making sure that the succession was determined before the chieftain died. Now, how were they picked? They were kind of nominated by the Taoiseach, but they would have to have the approval of their peers. And I kind of imagine this a little bit like the election of the Taoiseach, a little bit like how they elect the Pope today, which is like anybody can be Pope, right? But you don't even have to be a cardinal. But only cardinals can vote on who the Pope is going to be. And so the people who had the right to vote were called Rigdona, and that means the kingly material or kingly earth, those who are of kingly material. So they all had a vote, and the way I imagine it, and I don't know if this is what happened, but how I picture it would be that they would get together, they would have a feast, and they would start talking about who is going to be the next Taoiseach, the next chieftain, who was also called the 𝐺ℎ𝑒, and there was other names as well, which the 𝑇𝑒𝑎𝑛𝑔𝑎, 𝑇𝑒𝑎𝑛𝑔𝑎. And Taoiseach is the word that we use today in Irish politics. Then Oireachtas is an old Irish word which means gathering or parliament. And so you would have not just Oireachtas, there's also a dáil, which is another word for a gathering, official gathering. So you would have the dáil on the dáil 𝐺ℎ𝑒𝑎𝑟𝑟, which is the gathering on the hill of Tara. And Seanad is the only word that is borrowed from, I would say English, but English comes from Latin. So that's the only word that isn't like originally Irish. But we've adopted that word today. And you'll be happy to know, folks, that this is the last slide. These are the three main political parties in Ireland today. They're called Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and Sinn Féin. Now, if you don't speak Irish, you probably think that the first two parties sound the same because it's Fine and Fianna. But they mean two completely different things. And obviously Sinn Féin also has that kind of a sound of Fianna, Fine, Féin. So Fine Gael means the family or tribe of Gaels. And when you study Brehon law and you read about the family, the Brehon laws refers to the family as the Finne or Finny. And there was three different grades of Finny or Finne. The primary grade, which was considered your immediate family, was from your grandfather all the way down. So your grandfather, his sons, and his sons. And it was always patrilineal, which meant it always went by the male line. That's not to say that the matrilineal line didn't have importance. It did, but for the purposes of law, for the legal purposes, it was always patrilineal. So that first clan was called the Delafinne, which means the true clan. And that's kind of the root of where we get the word druid as well, because druid in one derivation means truth. Then the next segment, the next level of the clan was called the Gelfinne, which means the bright clan, or and that was all the people from your great grandfather down. So your great grandfather, all his brothers, all their children, all their cousins. It became quite a big unit very, very quickly. And then you had the Airfinne, which was the afterkin. And that was all of your relatives from your great-great-grandfather down. Now, but when I describe that, I'm describing it with you as being the center point of the family. And you're looking, my great-grandfather who's up there above me. But then you have to think of it from the great-grandfather's perspective as well. He has his own Deirfinne, Gelfinne, and Airfinne. And so then you also have to factor in all of the wives and the intermarriages that were happening. And so very quickly you realize that if you have Irish blood in you, you're probably related to everybody in the country. When you have this concept of not the immediate family, which is just mommy and daddy and the kids, but when you bring in the concept on the awareness that you are from a line of mighty ancestors that go back and survived all those struggles, survived all those famines, survived all those wars, survived all those cold winters, so that you could be here now. Which kind of reminds me of a story. Turlough O'Neill, he was a chieftain in Tyrone, incidentally, and a few traveling bards arrived at his kingdom, and he sent his messenger out to greet them. And he asked his messenger to ask them, what gifts did they bring for me? And the poets, the bards, said, well, tell Turlough O'Neill, your lord, that we will extol the virtues of his great clan, the O'Neills, which go back for generations. So the messenger returned to the high chieftain O'Neill and told him what the bards had said. And the response was, what? All this of my ancestors and nothing of me? I would rather throw lustre back on my family than take anything from it. Tell them they shall not want for anything while they're in my kingdom. In other words, give them a bed, give them food, give them entertainment, give them hospitality. But me they shall not see. And that's a very interesting way of thinking about your lineage and your legacy. I would rather throw lustre back on my family than take any from it. So Fine Gael means the family or tribe of Gaels. Fianna Fáil, Micheál Martin's party, means warriors of destiny. Fianna from Na Fianna, and that's where you have words like Fenian as a supposedly derogatory term for Irish people that the loyalists would use against us or against nationalists, I suppose, or Republicans. But it comes from Na Fianna, which were the exploits and the adventures of Fionn McCool. And Fall is, well, if you think of the Leofall, Stone of Destiny, and they've basically put these two words together. And that is another reason why I'm annoyed that Micheál Martin said, well, the Irish were never a homogenous group. And anyway, let's move on. Sinn Féin means ourselves. Um, and in the context of Eamon de Valera's Sinn Féin, like the Sinn Féin of the 1919 Sinn Féin, it implied ourselves alone, which was really speaking to the desire and the wish of the Irish people to look after their own affairs for a change. Now, this is not the same Sinn Féin that existed. The logo that you're seeing is the logo of the Sinn Féin from today, but the old Sinn Féin ceased to exist at a certain point in history. Um, and the new Sinn Féin, then took over. And I remember vaguely studying something in when I was studying law in DCU about the Sinn Féin funds case, like who should get access to the funds that were left over from the old party. Um, anyway, Fianna Gael, the family or tribe of the Gaels, Fianna Fáil, warriors of destiny, and Sinn Féin, ourselves. And that brings me to the end of part one of this presentation. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to look at your questions now. If anybody left any questions. Whoa, there's a lot of comments here. Thank you, all the sheaf, for that £10 contribution. I'm going to see if there's a comment there. Thank you, Kelly. You're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed the content. Let me just get rid of that comment. Oh, right. I'm just going to scroll through the chat room here. My granny was a scally. Who said that? Oh, same person. Variation of Scully, exactly. Blango man. Hello, Rob. Thanks for joining, Christina. You're very welcome. I hope you enjoy the content. Let me just check. I see you were having great conversations among yourself. I'm happy to see that. Excellent. Looking at the state of Ireland and the UK today, I don't know why Northern Ireland would want to be part of either state. Yeah, I agree, Chapman. That's a good point. Okay, I'm just reading through this comments here. Speaking for Ireland, housing crisis, mass immigration, laugh away, no genuine democracy, sham presidential election, musical chair Taoiseachs. Exactly. I mean, I don't like to get too political on this channel for obvious reasons, but I completely agree with those sentiments, unfortunately. Flea cap. Nice one, Dars. Um, okay. I'm nearly finished. I'm nearly through the whole list now. Um, I didn't know to Rachel 1234. I didn't know if he did do that, but it would be something that John Creedon would do. And the comment is, didn't the broadcaster from Cork, John Creedon, do a series on Irish names and places? He definitely did a book of Irish place names called The Place We Call Home, and I have it on my shelf over there just for reference purposes. And yes, it is very good and informative. I agree. Most people come out of 14 years of Irish language. That's another really good point. And it's when you ask Irish people, why can't you speak Irish? They seem to be slightly offended. And they say things like, Why would I want to speak Irish? It's a useless language anyway. I have no need for it, which I think is kind of a coping mechanism because deep down they're ashamed that they can't speak their own language. And it's partly got to do with how it's taught in school. And that's why Gael schools are so successful because they immerse people in the Irish language and they allow people to sit and soak and ruminate in the Irish language and till it becomes second nature to them. So when I try to speak Irish, I'm thinking in English and I'm trying to translate what I'm thinking in English into Irish, but it doesn't work that way. You have to think from Irish, you know? And actually, when I was learning Ukrainian, I found it easier to understand Ukrainian from thinking from the Irish rather than the English. Um, Tom Baines Glebes, everyone speaks Irish. It's beautiful there. Okay, the most northern part of the island. Yeah, got to pump those numbers up. I agree. It's a disgrace. Rob Duffy says there's very little incentive for people to speak it. And I agree, Rachel, 1234. What incentive is required, Mr. Duffy? Um, I do agree with that. Uh, what about just talking it for the love of the language and just like being able to express yourself in a language that most people don't understand? And today I had a phone call with a friend of mine who lives in Galway, and I was sitting on the train and we started speaking Irish to each other, and someone sitting across from me looked up and smiled at me. So, it's just good to, if you start doing it, other people will feel comfortable to start doing it as well. Chapman, I agree, and I'm also toying with going to adult Irish language classes. Um, once I have the time. Um, yeah. Rob Duffy, it's all about opportunity cost. Am I still streaming? I think I am. Um, we all move to incentives, but there's very little incentive. This is Rob Duffy again. Currently, because we do everything in English in Ireland, also the Dubs will resist using Irish more than rural Irish. Fair enough. Uh, Rachel 1234, not true. Dubs are very patriotic and speak Gaeilge, a long tradition of Gaeltacht in Leinster region. The main issue, though, is lack of native speakers. Interesting. Plenty of social activities in Dublin, Os Gaeilge. Kevin mentioned them himself in his talk. I used to be very involved and was regularly speaking Irish in Dublin with a few friends. That's great. Maybe we could arrange to get like a club together or something like that. Like, um, if people are interested, you can reach me. I'll give you the contact details at the end of this. You know what? You can find me on Facebook, and obviously you can message me through my website. I'll give you the email addresses. I'll put the links in the top pinned comment of this video. I literally can't. This is Exit 101. Which party has had an all-island majority? Which party brought a ceasefire? But because they represented armed resistance, you're clutching your pearls. I just can't, lol. Well, it's a different Sinn Féin. Like the old school Sinn Féin, it's not the same organization. So I do agree with that, like what you're saying, but they're not the same entity. They just have the same name, right? Okay, and that brings me to the end of the chat room. Excellent. And am I coming through still? Yep. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the presentation, and thank you for um, sticking with me through this. And I hope I didn't have many um, incidents like this where I was losing my words or losing my train of thought. Um, and to the VR the boss, that's a topic for another video. I'd like to talk about that, but I'll talk about it in a future video. I do have an article about that, I think, up on the website, so you can check that out. And for those who are interested, the website is brehonacademy.org. You can email me at kev@brehonacademy.org, or info@brehonacademy.org as well. Um, Subscribe, please, to this YouTube channel. Follow me on Facebook. We're also on Instagram. We have a smaller presence on X. We have a minimal, but I hope to do a bigger presence on TikTok in the future. We're also on Telegram. I'm going to put all of these links in the description and the top pinned comment. And just to remind you about the competition to win this book, I'm going to post it just for the basic members and above on YouTube posts. So if you want to be in with a chance to win this book, Manchán Magan, very well written book, and it's very sad that he has passed. I'm really sad about that. And so what I'd like to do is honor his memory by giving away this signed copy of his book. And I think that's it. So until next time, a 𝐺ℎ𝑒𝑎𝑟𝑟, Slán go fóill.